Welcome back to the CNAS 2022 Annual Conference. My name is Nathalie Grogan, and I am a Research Associate in the Military Veterans and Society Program here at CNAS. I will be moderating this session, Managing Talent to Secure America's Future. One of the things that makes CNAS unique is our focus on preparing the next generation of public servants for a career in national security, including both those in uniform and civilians. The Military Veterans and Society Program focuses on the human side of national security, military personnel issues such as recruitment and retention, civil-military relations, and supporting veterans following military service. This human element is necessary for the future of American national security. The challenges we face will require access to the most competitive talent the nation has to offer, and further requires a workforce that is trained, qualified, and ready to meet the future. Even the industrial side of national security, such as the development of hardware and platforms, requires a healthy national security workforce. In order to attract and retain the next generation of national security public servants, talent management is key. Talent management is a term that personnel wonks throw around, but this panel is intended to highlight its role in national security. It refers to anticipating what type of human capital will be required to meet the mission and planning as an organization to meet those needs through effective personnel policies, recruitment, hiring, and retention. In national security, talent management affects all important sectors and issues. In order for the government to carry out its mission of national security and keep Americans safe, we need the right professionals and the right career management tools. There are so many exceptionally qualified and talented Americans who are public servants or aim to pursue a career in public service, and we need them more than ever for the challenges of the future. The military services play a vital role defending the nation, and service members who make up the Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard, and Space Force are dedicated professionals. The services have instituted their own individual methods for addressing talent management through task forces that lay the groundwork for policy change and a culture of personnel development and career progression. While we look to uniformed recruitment and retention, it is also crucial to remember that the national security mission would be impossible without a robust civilian workforce. There are over 2 million civilians who work in the national security sector, distributed across the military services, State Department, the intelligence community, and Treasury, among others. These civilian jobs may be little understood outside of high-profile diplomatic and intelligence positions, but they are just as vital as their counterparts in uniform. Their talent management is equally as significant to the functioning of the U.S. government and protecting American interests. This is going to be a great panel, and I'm so excited to introduce our speakers. First, we're joined by Brigadier General Brett Funck, who is currently the director of the Army Talent Management Task Force in Washington, D.C. Next, we're joined by Mr. Tyler Zagurski, a retired Marine colonel, who serves as the director of the Talent Management Strategy Group and as a senior advisor for the modernization and force development for Headquarters Marine Corps. We're also joined by Loren DeJonge Schulman, our former colleague here at CNAS, and current Vice President of Research, Evaluation, and Modernizing Government at the Partnership for Public Service. Finally, we're joined by Kate Kuzminski, the Senior Fellow and Director of the Military Veterans and Society Program here at CNAS. Welcome to all the panelists. Before we dive into the moderated panel, I want to remind the audience that there will be an audience Q&A at the end. Make sure to submit your questions. Let's kick it off with a question for General Funck. General Funck, the Army really took the lead on talent management over a decade ago. Can you walk us through some of the things the Army has learned by shifting the focus within the manpower community towards true talent management?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question, Nathalie, and thanks for the introduction and letting me be a part of this discussion today. So, what I would start back a little bit, from when General McConville was the G1, in terms of the direction that he asked, and then directed the Army to look in terms of how do we actually, move to a talent-based system, vice, really kind of the industrial age system of what we've had. So we moved towards that data-centric aspect of it, and really kind of moving forward in terms of, hey, this is a different way, this is a newer way. Instead of just going from moving parts and pieces, it's actually now a little bit more precision in how we're actually identifying and then actually fitting the person to go with that skill set. So what have we learned? I would say that there's a couple key areas, and I would put it in 3 bins. One is that we have to have a language that we all speak for talent management. So when we go to that, what we're looking at is the ability to really say to ourselves, okay, what is this? This is, we all have to be on the same sheet of paper. So we talk in KSBs, knowledge, skills, behaviors. We can also use attributes in there. So that would be the first piece. But really, when you look at, the Army and you look at, 1 million strong, changing that language in that lexicon takes a significant amount of time across all fronts. So that would be really area number 1 that we had to focus on to be able to understand that. How did we do that? We developed our own talent alignment framework, talent attribute framework. And then we also used and built an idea that really came out of about 10 years ago or so, from an idea that came out of the engineers to really go to a preferencing marketplace type environment to hire and align individuals that would preference where they wanted to go based off of some self-professed KSBs. And that allowed us to learn quite a bit in there. The next aspect of what we learned about was we've really got to understand and work across the entire enterprise to have a talent assessment strategy. So what is this plan? And how are we going about it? And what's the difference between areas where we may be looking at those in the pre-commissioning years in the form of a talent assessment battery that would then move into a talent-based branching model. Then we would look into next aspects of this, which would go into developmental type areas, where that would go into what the Army's called Project Athena. And then we can get into some of the other assessments that we have out there that are more predictive in nature. And the predictive ones, really kind of the big end of it, would be the command assessment program, but we also have in there the Captain's Career Course Assessment Battery. Really, it's kind of a lifetime of assessments, so everyone becomes comfortable being able to understand themselves, but also being able to understand how they're leading organizations. And really, the third area that I would hit on here is the organization that needs to look at this continually, because things are moving fairly quickly, innovation's happening, but how are we actually doing this from the Army level on down to a very tactical level? And I've spoken with General Drew at our Human Resources Command in terms of really defining and operationalizing our aspects of what we're looking at. And if we want to look at it in in an operational framework, we are the policy and the plans aspect of it. So we're looking longer term. We may have some current, some future ops and current ops areas that we sprinkle in terms of things that are very, very near to us, very close to us. But the transition really turns into where HRC, our Human Resources Command, bridges over and takes really kind of manning cycles and a lot of the more future operations and current operation activities under their belt. So we're kind of thinking through things, we're piloting, we're experimenting, we're developing, and we're also working with our partners. Some of the things that we're doing are with the UK, are with Canada, Australia, and others, as well as within the Department of Defense. It's a lot of good learning that we're doing across the board. What I would say is that one of the other areas that is, we've recognized that, the NDAA in 2019 gave us quite a bit of additional authorities. And what I think we've learned in that time period is that to move to really effectively, harness the authorities that are inside of that NDAA, it's taking time to be able to really kind of move a culture of the industrial age really into the modern age. So that'll be the 3 key areas that I would say that we've learned on. But we are a learning organization, and honestly, just about every day we're learning something new. We're learning how to apply it, but we're also recognizing that there's got to be an organization like ours that are continuously looking at this for the foreseeable future. Thanks.
Thank you so much, General Funck, for that for that overview. Let's have the next question for Ty. Last November, the Marine Corps released a strategic document on talent management, U.S. Marine Corps Talent Management 2030. Can you talk to us a bit about what drove the development of the Marine Corps' new strategic approach to talent management?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for having me today, and great question. So just to back up a little bit, we had two commandants in a row who essentially said they don't believe the Marine Corps is properly trained, equipped, organized for a potential future fight against a near peer competitor or peer competitor. And so really about 2.5 years ago, the Marine Corps launched what became known as Force Design 2030, which was a service-wide sort of enterprise look at capabilities, formations, implementing new technologies that would be sufficient for a complex future environment, distributed units, new technologies that would require perhaps more mature Marines and a number of things. And so force design planning has been a major effort for a couple of years now in the Marine Corps, but I would characterize it to date as primarily focused on equipment modernization, capability development. And changes have been made, but Talent Management 2030 was really an effort for the Commandant to signal that it's more than just the formations and the capabilities and the technology. If we don't have the right talent for the future fight, for the future formation, for this complex environment, then, some of the force design changes are for naught. If we want to meet the aspirations of Force Design 2030, we really have to look at moving to a talent management model and replacing what has really been a largely unchanged system of manpower management for about 7 decades. And so he published Talent Management 2030 in November. It's a self-described work in progress, and I would say we're a little later start than the Army, but very similarly, we're looking at, I like to describe it as how do we attract, recruit, develop, and ultimately retain the right talent for Force Design 2030. And so they created TMX, which is my group, and I like to say a couple things about that. And for us, our manpower function is through MNRA, Manpower and Reserve Affairs. And I like to remind folks, this is not just an MNRA thing, because if you think of the way I just described talent management, attract, recruit, develop, ultimately retain, for us, you've just tripped across Recruiting Command, Training and Education Command, MNRA, and I would say ultimately CDNI, our Combat Development Integration, who is, designing the force and capabilities of the future. So we're looking across a number of sort of lines of operation. I call them buckets that the Commandant gave us in the talent management realm. We're looking at rebalancing recruiting and retention. Simply put, the future force and capabilities may require thicker grades within certain communities. Think of a previous formation that had sergeants as squad leaders. Maybe that's now a staff sergeant or a gunny. Same things with our logistics elements and other formations. And so that would yield a more mature force by grade that would require you to sort of rebalance what the Marine Corps has always done, which is bring in and assess large cohorts of young men and women that serve for typically 4 years, and a small amount of them, maybe 25%, actually retain and go on and enter into the career service. So we're looking at that. We're looking at things that sort of fit into career flexibility. The Marine Corps has, I think over time, often defined very narrow career paths that say, hey, you're an infantry officer, you're a aviation mechanic, here are the things specifically you will do over time, which led to a lot of PCS moves, sometimes inability to do certain things that a Marine and his or her family may want to do. So we're looking at ways, I call it multiple paths to success. Is there a command versus staff option for officers? Are there paths to success for enlisted Marines that don't necessarily include you have to be a drill instructor and things like that? And then, of course, we're looking at modern digital tools. And I like to say that occurs at echelons, right? I mean, at the service level, we've got to look at our network modernization. We've stood up some teams to look at network modernization, a data strategy, but then sort of below that and aligned with, our training and education command has modern tools that they are working to create. Manpower and Reserve Affairs, Marine Corps Recruiting Command, so that we've got sort of a service-wide modernization of the tools we need to really implement some of the strategies. The thing I really like to say about talent management is the in order to, and I remind folks all the time, the Marine Corps is not doing this just because we want to be nicer to certain grades and have their lives be easier. The in order to is a more lethal Marine Corps that's capable of the aspirations of Force Design 2030. The reality is we bleed talent out every year from a cohort that we haven't worked that hard to really retain to fill that more mature formation that may require more judgment, more experience, and things like that for a complex environment. So I'll pause there to see if that's sufficient or any questions.
Thanks so much, Ty. We'll pivot over to the civilian talent management side with a question for Loren. You have a unique dual perspective as both a former DoD and National Security Council civilian, and now as the Director of Research at the Partnership for Public Service, researching civilian talent within government. Can you talk us through some of the biggest trends you've seen in the evolution of talent management in the civilian sector, particularly among those within the national security enterprise?
Great question, Nathalie. And first, let me say I love this conversation. If I could have every National Security Council meeting end or maybe even begin with, do we have the talent that we need to actually implement this policy? That would be a huge win for all of us. So I'll start with bad news and I'll conclude with a whole lot of good pieces of good news. Bad news is on the civilian side of the house, we are far less mature than our uniformed colleagues in so many elements of talent management. We do not have a enterprise-wide national security talent management strategy or even really a vision, though I think there's a lot of people who have ambitions in this area. We don't have measures of readiness overall of what the talent that we need and how we would utilize it in a crisis or non-crisis situation for national security personnel. However, across the full cycle of talent management, there are so many good practices happening, usually at an agency level. You do see it far less often spreading from agency to agency or being a broader interagency strategy. So let me give you a couple of examples and hopefully those can be good models for success. First, just starting with the identification of today's hiring needs. There's several agencies, starting with the FBI, who use an attrition model to predict their needs in high demand fields from year to year. They know we have to hire 5 IT specialists every year. We have to hire 5 nurses every year, 5 people who speak a certain language. Let's just start recruiting them actively and build that into our process as opposed to waiting for somebody to leave and do anything else. There's a lot of fear about that and doing that in the civilian side of the house of not waiting until you have a vacancy, but it's totally allowed and people should be able to follow this model. Next is assessing future talent needs. And again, you see this in a couple of different agencies, but Nuclear Regulatory Commission, wow, 3 words that are hard to say, does an annual process where they look at trends over 5 years and forecast how will those trends impact the work that they do overall. With that, they try to predict out what are the positions and skills and capacities they'll need to actually complete their work and compare that to what they actually have on staff and what they think they'll need and use that to start designing what are the position descriptions of the future we're going to have and build their talent recruitment into that. Recruitment is a big challenge on the civilian side. There's a huge culture of post and pray, put it on USA Jobs, somebody's going to apply, it's going to be fine. That's being reversed in some areas where you see some agencies getting far more involved in the marketing of their agency and of their roles, using webinars, doing more active recruitment at colleges, and having a talent lead who will hold the hand of an applicant the whole way through the process. That sounds so antithetical to many people's experience of USA Jobs, but you see this that U.S. Digital Service started it, and it's become a practice done in other agencies as well. couple of more practices that I love. Candidate screening. Right now, the bulk of applicants who apply through USA Jobs do a self-assessment. They put in, are you qualified against these areas? And an automatic screening process says, yes, you are, and they rank you against other candidates, and there's not a lot of human involvement. There's a new process that is totally allowed across any hire on USA Jobs called the Subject Matter Expert Qualification Assessment. And it's what it sounds like. You bring some subject matter experts who, instead of doing a self-assessment, they assess the resumes of those who applied and rank order them before you do some of the other screening processes like veterans preference or other things. That process yields far more hires and far more retained hires than our typical USA Jobs process. And that, again, started with our friends at US Digital Service, but has been done at the State Department, the Department of Homeland Security, and many other places across a wide range of fields, technical and non-technical. Processing, all of us know how long it takes to go from I send my resume in to actually getting on board. The Air Force has great models here. They started creating a dashboard of every step along the way of when a hiring goes through the process and flagging where there was a problem, flagging when there was a barrier, where there was a slowdown, and put resources against it. But for those who do get hired, a lot of us in the national security field, you have to go through a security clearance process, which again extends the amount of time that it takes to actually start your job, and probably is a huge deterrent to those who are leaving college or have bills to pay or student loans. National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, NGA, just recently opened a non-cleared space for new hires to start before they got their top secret clearance, so that they can work, they can begin training, they can begin understanding the role of the agency, but they're not working on classified materials. Can you imagine how much of a change that would be if we implemented that across the national security enterprise? A few more points I'll bring up is onboarding. There's a huge number of people who start in the national security space who leave after their first 2 years. They think this field is not for me. I did not feel welcome. I did not feel at home. Onboarding is critical in this time period. Those first 2 years, experiential onboarding, mentors, career pathing, understanding where your career may take you in terms of branches and sequels is critical. And we just leave that too often to just, whatever happens to happen in somebody's career space. Not many agencies are doing exceptionally well in this space, but some are starting to do pilots that are really promising. Last two I'll mention, and this is areas, again, where we need to get better, is in the military we had under Goldwater Nichols, the requirements to be joint. And with that, the incentives to have people move across have different sorts of assignments, so they had different sorts of experiences depending on their background, so that before they could be promoted to a certain level, they had to have a certain kind of joint assignment. In the National Security Personnel System, which was used in the Bush administration, they had requirements for this if you wanted to be a certified national security professional. We got rid of that, and now you see something only like 8% of all senior executive service members actually move from agency to agency. Most career civilians stay in their home agency, stay in their lane, and don't get experience across the board. And when they do, too often it's punished or not really fully understood or utilized. That model has to change, and again, we have to look at the model of our uniform colleagues to see what the benefits of that. Finally, a culture of learning. We'll talk a little bit about this later on, I know, but I think a big thing that the civilian side can learn from our uniform colleagues is the role of professional development and training on a continuous cycle as a part of the talent management strategy. And yes, on both sides of the house, there's modernization needs to happen as against what our future security needs are going to be. But on the civilian side, it is far too often happenstance, under-resourced, and frankly, sometimes a way that you move problematic employees aside. That has to fundamentally change if we're going to keep and retain national security talent, and very importantly, reskill and upskill them for present national security needs and future security needs. We need to bring those investments into the civilian side of the house as well. We could go on for like 20 more minutes here, but I'll give the time back to Kate so that she can offer her perspective as well. Nathalie?
Thanks so much, Loren. It's really, really interesting to hear the civilian side. I'm actually going to pivot a little bit to General Funck about the Army. The Army has really innovated on command selection in the past few years with the development of the Battalion Commanders Assessment Program and the Colonel Commander Selection Program. Can you walk us through some of the aspects of the programs and how it changed outcomes in command selection?
Yeah, thanks. And this is an area where we continue to learn And it's been a very short period of time in terms of how, really when we started this and where we're at today. So if we just go back to when we first piloted this under General McConville telling us, hey, we've got to figure out, and improve and really kind of refresh the way that we're selecting what we would say in the Army are the most critical positions in terms of the impact on soldiers and formations, but also, the combination of both the tactical aspect of it, but also in other fields in terms of key staff officers and really the positions that on a day-to-day basis impact, tremendous amount of the Army. So it started out with a pilot, and I know General McConville and General McGee talked about this a couple of years back, but that pilot yielded some results that we saw as very, very promising. And now what we've done is we've taken this commander's assessment program and we've kind of grown it to the point where if you're a lieutenant colonel or a major promotable wanting to go into a command or key staff position, you've got to go through the commander's assessment program. It's been expanded to include medical commands at the 06 level. It's inside the acquisition corps, and we're also working and going through it with our chaplains at senior levels as well. And we can't forget about our sergeant majors. So the sergeant majors, if you want to become a brigade sergeant major, so a sergeant major at the 06 level, you go through this assessment program as well. Now, they all follow the same, what I would say, construct, but they're all nuanced based off of different, positions and in terms of different audiences and different populations that they're leading. But fundamentally, it's all, built out of the, the leadership manual for the Army. So what have we learned about this? One is, really the answer in the question of that I've gotten quite a few times is, what were we trying to fix? Well, it's not that we were trying to really necessarily go after and fixing. It's, hey, how do we get a better process? How, if these are our leaders, and we've said numerous times that, our leaders and soldiers are our decisive advantage against our adversaries, well, what are we doing about that to go beyond just an evaluation report? So really a one-dimensional look of these key leaders. So, why are we doing this? Because we need to, because the impact of what we see as what those leaders can have on a formation, but also in terms of winning our nation's wars. So what does it do? It provides additional relevant information. There's objective assessments. Everyone takes those assessments in controlled environment at Fort Knox, so that it's a consistent, fair series of assessments that we can actually look at and say, here's how they scored against, a set of, peers, or I should say, really previous year groups in terms of understanding where they're at. So that would be number one. It allows the Army, the panel of officers and general officers that are selecting these individuals to look at it and say, okay, it's not just an evaluation. Now it's a fitness. There's a written, there's a verbal, there's some psychometric testing going on. There's reading. There's also some observed behavior activities that go on. So it's really getting a multi-dimensional look at that individual, as well as a significant amount of peer and subordinate feedback. So not traditional in the 360 where a leader would pick those that he or she wants to get that evaluation on. And we are actually the ones that are picking from within the Army, really kind of based off of a couple methods to randomly select individuals from 1 to 5 years behind that individual to tell them, really to inform the panel, hey, this is how this leader performed in this position. So you can see previous commanders and you can see previous staff officers, how they did. So it's really a reflection of their leadership in those positions. We also have self-assessments in there, and there's also a operational psychologist interview, which all leads up to, an interview process. And in the interview process, what we've done is we've really tried to remove any of the unconscious bias so that they're looking at the leadership talents of that individual. How have we done that? We've done that by it's a double-blind interview All of the information that the panel members are looking at is anonymized, so they are unable to actually see names. They're unable to see branches. But what they can see is really what that leadership or what that leader has done in previous jobs, and what that leader thinks of themselves versus what their peers and subordinates think of them. The other piece in terms of removing some of the bias is that we every day go through bias training prior to a panel meeting. We also have a whole bunch of recusals that go on to make sure that there haven't been certain people that have worked for others that are inside of that panel. So we've learned quite a bit through this process. Where we started is really not where we're at right now. We learned through that. So we've automated certain pieces. We've adjusted certain pieces. We've differentiated between the lieutenant colonels and colonels. We've also looked at the sergeant majors in terms of differentiating that. And we've really listened to a lot of different leaders and those coming through to make sure that it's it's a world-class, fair, consistent product. The other piece that I would say is that what we've identified is that through this, we've really got some validated objective assessments that really allow us to look at leaders and compare to identify them in other areas outside of what traditionally a rater or senior rater would only see that person in. So we're able to get a much deeper look of that person. And then, in terms of where I'd say we somewhat can measure ourselves in success, I think in terms of looking at how we are exporting this is a fairly positive thing, because we have just come back from the UK, where they have asked us to help them in implementing this at their senior levels. We are in the process to go down to Australia to go down and help them in their process and speak to their leadership, as well as up in Canada. So we are leading the way in quite a few aspects of this. And I guess in some ways of looking at it as we're kind of breaking brush and learning, and those that are coming behind us inside of the Department of Defense are actually probably able to implement some of this faster based off of what we've learned and how we've implemented across, across these couple of years. The one area that we still are working through is the data aspect of it. Understanding this, making sure that it's in the right form, making sure that we've got it captured and it stays with an individual over their entire career. Because to be, to go where, a couple of the previous questions were going is we're not only in a fight for talent, to make sure that the Army's got it, but, as you heard Ty talk about, the Marine Corps needs it, the Air Force needs it, Space Force needs it, private, company in America needs it, public company in America needs it, our educational institutions need it. So we are competing against a whole slew of others, not just our adversaries, to make sure that we've got the best and the brightest leading our formations. And it is kind of interesting to when we do talk to, private sector America, and we recognize that they do see, the talent and the capabilities that the Department of Defense brings, and maybe that, it's getting, it's got to be as competitive, and it's got to be at the top edge. And if we're not treating it as such from a talent management standpoint, it does turn into a national security risk, and it exposes ourselves. So we've really got to pay attention to this. And I would just say the last piece on this, and because I could talk forever on this topic, would be just recognizing that, there are other, venues and avenues that we have to recognize can bring individuals into the Army, into, other services. We've got to recognize that, flexible career paths, ability to move between, a Compo 1 to Compo 3 or Compo 1 to Compo 2 or Compo 2 to Compo 1 fairly fluidly is really important. We also have to recognize that it's not just the monetary incentives that a lot of our younger generation are looking at. It's monetary and non-monetary. So how are we doing that, and what's the implications of really the past couple of years that we've had and seen as to how we're recruiting, how we're, retaining, how we're developing our most talented individuals out there. So thanks very much for that question. Very, very, very real topic that we're working through on a daily basis.
Thanks so much for that thoughtful answer. It was really, really illuminating. Ty, one of the most impressive elements of Talent 2030 was the way in which it ties evolving operational concepts, particularly expeditionary advanced basing operations, to the ways in which the Marine Corps recruits, develops, and retains Marines. Can you talk to us about the advantages that Talent 2030 provides for operations? I think you're on mute, Ty. Unfortunately, Ty, I think you're on mute. We'll a question go to Kate, and we'll see on your end. Kate, we here at CNAS have been diving into the civilian national security pipeline, identifying the motivations of those who are interested in government service through a survey and a series of focus groups. Can you preview some of the research findings that we're seeing?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I'll say is that we should absolutely be encouraged by what our research is showing. There's such a high desire among the next generation and many who are already well into their careers to serve in government at some point, and specifically to serve in the national security community. These are individuals who are going to great lengths to ensure that they have the skills and experiences necessary to serve in the national security community and in government. They're pursuing advanced degrees and certifications. They're seeking out critical language skills. They're spending time abroad. They're building up their STEM certifications. They're willing to take on mountains of student loan debt to follow that up with unpaid internships or low-paying entry-level jobs in government just for the chance to serve. But we're also seeing that there's some challenges for that population. Despite the strong interest and the development of critical skills and experiences, and despite the fact that these individuals have what the government needs and the government wants these individuals, there's some difficulty bridging the gap there between interest and employment. There's been real improvements to the clearance process timeline for civilians over the last couple of years, but it still serves as a major hindrance for entry into government service. And the reality is that someone coming out of grad school or law school with a mountain of student loan debt, or someone with a family, is willing to take a lower paying job in government than they might get in the private sector, but they're not able to wait for 6 or 12 or 18 months to receive a paycheck because they're waiting on a security clearance. We've also seen a bit of path dependence in their career options. So this is particularly affects individuals who graduate during a hiring freeze, which have been used in increased frequency in the past few years with the existence of continuing resolutions. So, you know, a bright law student who graduates in a time of a hiring freeze, who had every intention of serving in government, they're getting a job at a law firm instead because they can't join the federal government to work on national security issues, and they hit the partner track and there's no getting them off of that. I think some areas of positivity to look forward to as well is, you know, though COVID really, you know, put a wrench in a lot of our plans, one of the things that it really did was democratize the way that people have access to mentors in the national security community. So relationships and networks and mentoring still really matter in the federal government. But for someone who went to grad school in Kansas like myself, there's now the option to you know, have a Zoom meetup with someone instead of the culture really driving towards, you know, in-person coffees and panel events and cocktail hours where people are meeting those who are currently serving in government. So I think there's new avenues for access to potential mentors and guides in that respect. I'll leave it on the fact that the interest to serve is strong.
Thank you so much, Kay. I think we're all really excited to hear the rest of these findings out of from the MVS program. We can head back to Ty and see if her mic's connected.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
I heard your question. My apologies. Ironically, I'm at a talent management summit that we're hosting with reps from across our Fleet Marine Forces. So I'm hiding in the kitchen on their Wi-Fi. So a great question. And I'll sort of start where I ended last time, just to reiterate that talent management is really part of force design, right? And I like to call it the three-legged stool right now. And the commandant has said, force design is not just equipment modernization and capability development, but we're at the point now we need to look at both talent management and training and education. And that really, to me, is the three-legged stool of force design. And the advantage it has given us is it put us into that ecosystem and that structure that as we make force design changes, there's a ton of experimentation and analysis that's going on. That's able to feed the talent management enterprise, and we're really looking holistically all the way back to accessions at attributes and interests to better match Marines with the capabilities required, and then puts us in line with Training and Education Command to understand how do we better develop Marines, how do we distribute learning at the right time and right place so that we're not only developing the right Marines, but then on the back end through talent management, how are we retaining the right Marines for the future fight? And again, for me, and I like to say this, it always goes back to the requirement, right? I'm not retaining more Marines just because I love Marines and I want more of them. I'm retaining them because the future formations we're trying to build and the capabilities required in a complex environment are going to need more gunnies and staff sergeants, maybe less corporals and sergeants, more lieutenant colonels and majors, maybe less captains. So we are in on the ground floor, if you will, of force design and the experimentation analysis that's really driving talent management.
Thank you so much. For the final moderated question before we turn to the audience, we'll pivot over to Loren and Kate. The strategic level where policy and operational decisions are being made requires a healthy relationship between the civilian enterprise and senior uniform leadership. What are some of the challenges you've seen or identified with respect to the different professional development pathways we see between civilian and military experience? Let's start with Loren because she did touch on this earlier, and then go over to Kate.
It's a great question, Nathalie. So first, I want to kind of differentiate between different types of civilians and different types of folks with military experience. You have the civilians who work in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, whose role is to act as the Secretary's eyes, ears, hands, to work with the uniformed services every day. And they're the policy lens through which we are doing so. Second group is non-Office of the Secretary of Defense civilians, and across the interagency, whether the State Department, the Department of Agriculture, Transportation Security Administration, nearly any agency is working with the military in some form over the course of a couple of years. Third category is political, who are coming at it from a different perspective. On the military side, you have those who, and this is a massive overgeneralization, those who are in the military who has some form of policy-aligned, policy-adjacent experience, working in the Joint Staff, working at a command, maybe detailed to another agency, or as a part of a service staff. And then there are those who have far more maybe operational or other sorts of experience who don't have that. All of them are coming at this with their own experience, biases, education, and so on, but frequently they are thrown together to work through some sort of strategy or policy problem together. So think about the different perspectives they're bringing. In OSD, they've got a deep familiarity with how they work with the U.S. military in the DoD context, but they are not always trusted by, for instance, the Joint Staff or their counterparts in the White House. Non-OSD civilians, they have less familiarity, but they are often called upon to do collaboration and coordination with the military in an interagency context, from anything from a crisis, we need help on the border, or we need help addressing, providing vaccines, or to work together in some sort of operational experience, like, well, this is less operational, but like more in Ukraine, how are we providing assistance to Ukraine? Political quite often are coming in with very little experience or exposure to the U.S. military at all. They are thwarted by the basics of what do the little ranks on your shoulders mean? What is the difference between the services? How do I tell the difference between somebody who is a 4-star versus an E9? And how does that impact my work, and how do I care, and how do I talk to them? Basic levels are often part of their educational needs and their training needs. Understanding the makeup, the role, the missions, and the operations and activities of the military, what it does and doesn't, specific statutory roles, how the chairman fits in, who has command authority, and the relationship between the U.S. military and politics. All of those things are often very new to political appointees as they come in. So in each of those, people are coming in with their own experiences, things that they have learned in their professional development, things that they've learned in their ongoing work life, or even just things they've learned on television. Having some sort of reset, often at the beginning of a job, at the beginning of an administration, beginning of a policy process, to remind everyone, all right, here's roles, here's what we expect of one another, here's how we're going to communicate, is often useful no matter how much time you have spent reading every civ-mil theorist known to man. Or if you've never done that and just happened to watch a lot of Black Hawk Down. Either way, coming to the table and being able to reset around a particular policy, strategy, operational problem, and understand who is doing what backgrounds they come from, where they fit in their own ecosystem, who they have to report to. These are often things that we make assumptions about with one another across the civil spectrum, but don't often get those assumptions right, particularly at the outset, no matter how much experience you have. So that's how I've seen that breakdown, and that's a general recommendation I would have of how to approach it.
Thanks so much, Loren. Kate, what is your perspective?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we forget is on the uniform side, again, this is where the uniform side has really taken the lead. There at every echelon before command, as you enter as a lieutenant in the Army, as you enter as a lieutenant, as you move on to being a captain, you head into company command, you promote up to field grade ranks, and even especially when you're moving into more senior leadership. There's professional military education at each echelon that focuses on tactics, operations, up to strategy, and a lot of the norms and social mores of the interaction between the civilian and the uniform side take place on the uniform side through professional military education. Many civilians don't get that kind of training through their career if they're a career civil servant. There are some opportunities for more senior civil servants to take a year at the Naval War College or the Army War College, but those are folks who've been in the system for over 15 years and are they've succeeded because they've caught on to those civ-mil dynamics. It becomes increasingly important too when we consider that sometimes political appointees are, as Loren said, they may not have familiarity with the Pentagon or the building. They may also be significantly younger than their counterparts in uniform who've spent decades learning what's expected of the relationship. And so there can be some tensions there that then play out at the table when there's the drafting of the National Defense Strategy, or when we're thinking about our approach to Afghanistan or Ukraine. And so, really building in more professional civ-mil education throughout the career on the civilian side, I think will mitigate some of those tensions, because in a lot of ways the military is really out ahead of where the civilian side is.
Thanks so much, Kate and Loren. We do have an audience question from Stu that we'll kick it over to General Funck first and then Ty, and then we'll see if there's time remaining. Senior leadership often cites the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines as the most important resource, but funding efforts tend to be more focused on new technology. How can senior leadership and Congress better resource personnel rather than new ships and aircraft? General Funck?
Yeah, thanks. And so you heard me say earlier a little bit, one, in terms of a prioritization. So, Chief of Staff of the Army, in terms of its people first. So what does that mean? If we look at a couple of things out there, we are more people centric than a lot of other we have people is our system in terms of how we operate. So when we look at that and take a step back, how do we actually get to what we're talking about in terms from a funding standpoint, or from an incentive standpoint, or from a way that we can look at this that incentivizes service. So what we've taken is a look at it and said, okay, what are the monetary and non-monetary? So is there a way that we can handle that? Is there, an example of that would be monetary is, straightforward, but non-monetary is, hey, we need you to work a different job, but you don't need to move. You can do that job, instead of going from Fort Hood to Fort Carson, you can stay right at Fort Hood, or you could stay right at Fort Carson. We just have to make sure that you've got the ability to do everything by remote work. Not everything's going to work that way, but that's a very simple step. Not only does that actually aid in the stability of the individual, but also his family or her family, but it actually reduces some of your moving costs. So there's some things in there that we've got to kind of really look at and recognize that that's a way of getting after it. So it'd be more like a permanent change of duty versus a permanent change of station approach to going through this. The other one that I would hit on here is, in terms of, I said it before, fluidity, but it's really, permeability of moving between compositions. There may be time in a career where an individual wants to go from active duty to the Army Reserve, and that could be because of a family concern, that maybe there's 2 or 3 years of time they need to go into the Army Reserve to, move through whatever that challenge may be and then come back. There may be those in the Army Reserve that want to come into active duty. We've tried, and we're really experimenting with some of it now. And what we've done is we've got ability for warrant officers to retire on active duty but go into and continue flying. So we've got that approach. We've had some success in terms of lieutenant colonels that would not have had the opportunity from an inventory standpoint to command specific type units on the active side, and we've had them move over to commanding on the reserve side, same type units. So think like veteran, vet command, and think through like MP commands, where there's an opportunity and it's positive for all parties because they would not have been able to be filled by a battalion commander. Lieutenant colonel, if we didn't take that approach, also, but the individual was very willing and wanting and desiring to do that in the location they wanted to be in. So it was kind of win-win across the board. It didn't cost any extra money, but that's another way of looking at a non-monetary incentive to approaching some of this. I also think that the aspect of an incentive is that, if we look at, and I don't have to look any, further than my oldest son, at the age of 20, in terms of wanting to have a greater, advocacy or, their own voice in how they're approaching the Army and what they want to say and how leaders are listening and how they're informing. I think our ability to just say that, hey, we've taken the steps of CAP, the Commander's Assessment Program, we're addressing some of those things right now. That is a means of saying, hey, this is a great way of moving forward. On the in terms of where we could use some assistance, I think it would be, a couple of the areas that we have to work through are, tied to statutory requirements. So maybe there could be some slack in there in terms of how we can move between compositions of the Army. I know that we've got some proposals moving forward, but that could be one of the ways to ease a little bit of that pressure in terms of some of our, warrant officer programs as well as some of our commissioned officer programs. So thanks. Over to Loren and Kate.
Yeah, thanks so much. That's Ty. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I would first and foremost mimic what the commandant told me when I asked him, can we afford it? He said, I can't afford not to do this, right? It's that important. It's his priority. So that, of course, helps with programming. Like the Army, we are a Marine-centric organization. So culturally, we're not opposed to spending money on Marines. I think we have the lowest cost per service member generally, but that doesn't mean we're not used to spending money on Marines because they are who we are. Strategy-wise, and I've talked to the assistant commandant about this several times. He was just at my summit yesterday, and he said, just tell me how much it is, I'll get the money. And so I've had a pretty regular drumbeat with PSMs over on the Hill. It is a regular part of our legislative sort of battle rhythm to articulate and express what the Marine Corps' priorities are, and clearly some of the talent management initiatives are going to cost money, and we've begun signaling very clearly that this is a priority for us. But I'll also note the savings potential in this. A lot of the initiatives we're looking at when we rebalance recruiting and retention are aimed at getting at things like non-EAS attrition, boot camp attrition, and things like that frankly cost a lot of money. And so there is some cost savings. Although a more mature, smaller force in the aggregate costs more money, there will be some cost savings along the way as we become more efficient with things like non-EAS attrition and retention. So,
Thank you, Ty. Loren, what is your perspective on the civilian side? You're muted, Loren. We can't hear you, Loren. I think your mic got disconnected.
I'm back.
There we go.
All right. Quick comment on the military side, then I'll move to the civilian side. On the military side, right now we spend about a quarter of our defense budget on personnel right now. That does not include some of the costs associated with veterans' health or retirement or other costs. So there's actually a significant investment. However, I think there's a really good question embedded in this is, are we spending smartly? And also, are we spending in ways that align personnel with those technology investments? I think in many ways we are, but I think more transparency and communication about that are critical. And also joining those conversations that I talked about at the beginning of my remarks earlier, so that when we talk about, we need more investments in AI, that conversation has to include, we also need more investments in personnel, coders who understand AI, policymakers who understand artificial intelligence, procurement people who understand how to purchase it, and others who understand how to integrate it into our various systems. All of those things are personnel investments and requirements that need to be better integrated into the conversations around major technology investments that we are pursuing. On the civilian side of the house, wow, we love to shortchange civilians in some ways and make massive investments in other places. And there's flexibilities that are provided in some spaces that should be more broad overall. Cyber personnel, people are so excited about wanting to invest in cyber civilians. However, a lot of the flexibilities that go with that and a lot of the pay incentives that go with that are tremendous ideas, should be spread more broadly across the civilian personnel system. Because one of the risks is that we create all these special tactics around cybersecurity personnel that aren't really well understood and therefore aren't really well utilized. And therefore, we just tend to take the less risky path of going back over to the traditional civilian hiring authorities. We don't actually make use of any of the goodness that we have. Making use of hiring authorities, incentives, and other pay structures that we see given out in little special increments across different career fields should be spread more broadly, so those human capital personnel who have so much work to do can better understand what authorities they maintain. Kate, would love to hear your thoughts too.
Yeah, so I'm going to stick with the on the military side. One of the kindest things that Congress and that the SASC did for the services back in 2019 was introduce a number of flexibilities. They were referenced earlier in this conversation. In my previous role at the RAND Corporation, we really evaluated how the services were thinking about using them, what some of the holdups might be in actually using these flexibilities. Again, they weren't prescriptive and they weren't a command from Congress, but they allow things like lateral entry of more senior individuals. So if you want a logistician from FedEx, you could bring them in as an 06 as opposed to the previous cap of an 04. It kind of lifted some of the constraints that were placed on the traditional 20-year career path and everyone looking exactly the same. But when we evaluated that, what some of the hindrances were, there really weren't any legislative hindrances. There weren't necessarily policy hindrances. It wasn't going to cost more money, but the real change will come at the cultural level. So the acceptance of career paths not necessarily looking lockstep from the day someone commissions as an officer until the day they retire. And I think that's going to take a little bit of time to build that kind of culture throughout the military services.
Thanks so much, Kate. And that's all the time we have for this panel. Thank you to all the speakers and our audience for such a fascinating discussion on talent management. This panel was just the beginning of a larger conversation at CNAS. Stay tuned for a forthcoming report on the civilian national security workforce. Thank you all for joining us. Our next panel, Dangerous Straits, Wargaming a U.S.-China Conflict over Taiwan, will begin in just a few moments. Please stay tuned for a special session with Chuck Todd that dives into the CNAS wargame that aired recently on Meet the Press, coming up next.